DMV True and Scary Horror Stories in the Mountains. Story 1. The Dyatlov Pass Case. The wind howled across the snowy landscape, sweeping fine ice crystals through the air and casting eerie shadows in the thin light of late afternoon. In February of 1959, 9 young hikers from the Ural Polytechnic Institute prepared to climb the treacherous slopes of the Ural Mountains, a range known for its harsh conditions and rugged isolation. The expedition leader, Igor Dyatlov, stood at the front of the group, his dark eyes surveying the route ahead, calculating each step as he navigated through the pathless wilderness. The Ural Mountains were legends among the local Mansi people, who called this area Kolochakal, or the Mountain of the Dead. Dyatlov and his team dismissed the superstitions, laughing off tales of curses and spirits wandering the forests. After all, they were experienced mountaineers, bound together by years of friendship and a deep-seated passion for adventure. Yet, as they set up their tents and prepared for the cold night ahead, there was a weight in the air that none of them could ignore. Each hiker brought with them their own reasons for taking on this challenge. Lyudmila Dubinina, strong-willed and determined, had survived frostbite in a previous expedition and wore her scars with a fierce pride. Yuri Doroshenko, known for his quick humor and strength, had once fought off a bear to save a friend, an act that had become part of his legend among their circle. Zinaida Kolmogorova was a quiet but relentless presence, an anchor for the group, while Rustem Slobodin, always thoughtful, was known for his unshakable focus. As they gathered around the small fire, warming their hands against the frigid air, a shadow seemed to pass through the trees, a subtle movement in the corner of Zinaida's eye. She turned sharply, her breath catching as she searched the darkness. Nothing, just the endless stretch of trees shifting in the wind. She shook her head, willing herself to dismiss it. "Did you hear that?" Yuri Udin, the youngest and most reserved of the group, looked around, his voice barely above a whisper. His fingers gripped the edge of his coat as if to ward off an invisible chill. "It's nothing," Igor assured him, though his eyes held a quiet tension. "We're just not used to this silence." Yet, as the night deepened, they each felt a prickle of unease, an instinct buried beneath the thrill of adventure. The morning arrived veiled in mist, as if the mountain itself wanted to obscure their view of what lay ahead. The hikers broke camp, packing their gear in silence, the laughter and chatter of the night before replaced by a strange quietness. Despite Igor's confidence, a shadow seemed to linger over the group as they began their ascent. The snow deepened as they climbed, each step becoming a struggle against both the incline and the biting cold. They were entering an unmarked path, no signs of previous climbers, no trails from animals, only the endless white landscape surrounding them. The silence of the mountain was unnerving, broken only by the crunching of boots on snow and the faint rustle of their jackets in the wind. As they made their way higher, Zinaida noticed something strange. A series of tracks, barely visible in the snow, leading off toward a dense grove of trees. The prints were large, irregular, almost like human footprints, but distorted, stretched in odd directions. She motioned to Igor, who paused, studying the tracks with a frown. "An animal, maybe," he said, though there was uncertainty in his voice. "Let's keep moving, we don't have time to waste." But the tracks followed them, appearing again farther up, as if whatever had left them was trailing the group. No one spoke of it, but each hiker's gaze shifted nervously toward the trees whenever they caught sight of the prints. Yuri Doroshenko, usually the first to crack a joke in tense situations, walked in silence, his eyes scanning the forest with a guarded intensity. By late afternoon, they reached a plateau where they planned to camp. The view stretched for miles, a sea of icy peaks rolling in every direction. They began setting up their tents, the routine bringing a sense of normalcy to the eerie quiet that hung around them. But when the sun dipped below the horizon, an intense cold swept over them, far sharper than they'd expected. Their breath crystallized in the air, and every sound seemed amplified against the pressing silence. As the night closed in, Zenaida felt an inexplicable urge to look out beyond the camp, her gaze fixed on a dark silhouette barely visible among the trees at the edge of their sight. A figure, tall, thin, unmoving. A shiver ran through her, and she blinked, only to find the figure gone. "Zina, are you all right?" Lyudmila asked, her voice low, almost as if afraid to disturb the night. Zenaida forced a smile, nodding. "Yes, just the wind, I think." But in the pit of her stomach, she felt a creeping dread. Something was watching them from the shadows, and she wasn't sure if they could ignore it for much longer. Night pressed in from all sides, heavy and stifling. The hikers huddled inside their tents, each wrapped in their thoughts as the wind outside picked up, howling like a distant cry. The warmth of their bodies barely held back the relentless cold that seeped through the fabric. And sleep came fitfully, stolen in snatches between sharp gusts of icy air. Igor lay awake, listening to the wind scrape against the mountain. The quiet intervals, where everything went deathly still, unsettled him more than the sound. He glanced over to where Yuri Yudin was lying beside him, the younger man's face pale, eyes wide open, clearly too anxious to sleep. "I don't know, Igor," Yuri murmured finally, breaking the silence. "It feels like there's something out there, watching, following." Igor took a steadying breath. "We're alone, Yuri. It's just us and the mountain. Sometimes silence can be as unnerving as any sound." But the words felt hollow. He couldn't shake the memory of the tracks, and he caught himself glancing toward the tent's opening, half expecting to see that shadowy figure Zenaida had mentioned. It had only been a flicker in her vision, she'd assured them, but it had been enough to put them all on edge. In the other tent, Zenaida and Lyudmila lay side by side, listening to the muffled conversation from next door. Zenaida hugged her knees, replaying the image of that dark figure in her mind. She tried to convince herself it was just a trick of the light or her imagination, twisted by exhaustion. But every time she closed her eyes, the shadow returned, its form taller and more defined. "I'm sure I saw it," she whispered to Lyudmila, as if saying it out loud would somehow make it real. Lyudmila reached over, placing a firm hand on her friend's arm. "You're not alone in this, Zina. We're all here, all together. Whatever it was, it can't hurt us." But her voice wavered, and Zenaida sensed the same uncertainty in her friend. Outside, the wind dropped again, plunging everything into an oppressive silence. And then, faintly, from somewhere near the edge of the trees, came a sound. A low, rhythmic scraping like something heavy being dragged through the snow. The two women froze, clutching each other, barely daring to breathe. In the next tent, Igor and Yuri heard it too, and their blood ran cold. Yuri gripped Igor's arm, his face ashen. "Did you hear that?" Igor nodded, his body tense. He had prepared for every imaginable danger, avalanche, blizzards, frostbite. But this was different. This felt personal, like the mountain itself was responding to their presence. For a long moment, the entire group sat in the dark, listening, straining their ears against the silence. The scraping sound faded, swallowed by the night, but an overwhelming sense of dread lingered, wrapping around them like a smothering blanket. They were not alone on this mountain, and whatever else was out there was closer than they'd ever dared to imagine. Morning came, but with little comfort. A gray dawn broke over the camp, casting a pale light across the landscape, yet doing nothing to lift the unease that had taken root in each of their minds. The hikers emerged from their tents, faces drawn and eyes heavy with fatigue. They exchanged glances but avoided talking about the noises they'd heard. It was as if the quiet acknowledgement of their shared fear would only make it more real. As they packed up the tents, Rustam noticed something strange. A set of fresh tracks encircling the campsite. The prints were too large and too deep to be from any animal he could name, and they appeared as though something, or someone, had paced back and forth, watching them while they slept. He crouched to get a better look, his brow furrowed. "Does anyone else see this?" The others gathered around, peering down at the tracks in silence. Yuri Doroshenko's face went pale as he traced the path of the footprints with his eyes. realizing that they led straight up to the tents before curving away back into the forest. It was as if whoever had made them had been watching, observing them up close before retreating. "We were being watched," Yuri Yudin whispered, his voice barely audible. All night, Igor forced himself to stay calm, though his hands clenched tightly around the straps of his backpack. "Let's not jump to conclusions," he said, attempting to reassure them, though his own heart raced. It could be an animal, or maybe even the wind distorted the prints, but no one seemed convinced. The tracks were far too precise, too purposeful to be a trick of the elements, and each hiker could feel it, an invisible presence pressing down on them, heavy and unrelenting. The mountain felt more oppressive than ever, as if it were somehow tightening around them. As they resumed their hike, the silence between them grew heavier, punctuated only by the crunching of their boots in the snow. The trees loomed taller and darker, their branches intertwining overhead, blocking out the thin winter sunlight and casting eerie shadows along the path. A sense of isolation settled upon them, and even the familiar act of hiking felt foreign and sinister. Zenaida lagged slightly behind the group, her eyes flitting nervously toward the dense forest beside them. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was moving just beyond the trees, slipping between the shadows, always just out of sight. She quickened her pace, closing the gap between herself and the others, but the feeling of being followed remained. At midday, they stopped to rest, but no one seemed hungry. Instead, they sat huddled together, clutching their gear in silence, as if afraid that even a small lapse in attention might invite something dark into their midst. Lyudmila shivered, despite being wrapped in layers of clothing, and pulled out her camera, capturing a few pictures of the bleak surroundings, almost as if wanting proof of the strange day. Igor finally broke the silence, trying to lift their spirits. "We're making good progress. If we keep this pace, we should reach the final ascent by tomorrow afternoon." But his words sounded hollow, and no one responded. Each member was lost in their own thoughts, haunted by the strange sounds and the fresh tracks they couldn't explain. When they resumed their climb, the shadows around them seemed to stretch, creeping closer with every step. And in the silence of the mountain, they all began to realize something they'd been avoiding. This was no longer just an expedition. Something was out here with them, stalking them from the shadows, biding its time. As night began to fall once again, a shared understanding hung in the air. The mountain held secrets that did not wish to be disturbed, and whatever those secrets were, they were inching closer with each passing hour. As the second night settled over the mountain, the air grew thick with an almost tangible tension. Shadows deepened, swallowing the faint light as the group huddled together, anxiously preparing their tents in a small clearing. No one spoke, but their movements were hurried and jerky, betraying the quiet panic building inside them. Igor tried to keep the group steady, setting up the tents as usual and distributing the last of their rations. The food tasted bland, barely noticeable against the growing sense of dread. Yuri Yudin's hands shook as he held his spoon, spilling more than he ate. Across from him, Rustam kept glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting something to emerge from the trees at any moment. The silence was broken by a distant sound, a low, moaning echo that seemed to reverberate from the depths of the forest. It was unlike anything they had heard before, a hollow, inhuman wail that rose and fell in the night air, stirring an instinctive fear within them. "Did you hear that?" Lyudmila's voice was a whisper, her eyes wide with terror as she scanned the darkness around them. No one answered, but their expressions mirrored her fear. Igor cleared his throat, trying to appear calm, though his heart pounded in his chest. "It's probably the wind," he said, though he knew the words sounded hollow. This sound was different, carrying with it a sense of despair that clung to the air long after it faded. They sat in silence, listening, waiting. The night pressed down upon them, thick and oppressive. Then, from the darkness, came another sound, a soft crunch of snow, close, too close. Everyone froze, their breath caught in their throats, each of them straining to see what lay just beyond the ring of faint light cast by their small campfire. And then, the figure appeared. A tall, gaunt shape lingered at the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the shadows. Its body was skeletal, limbs elongated in unnatural proportions, and its eyes, or where its eyes should have been, were two hollow pits, dark and staring. It stood there, unmoving, as if studying them with an intent that sent a shiver through each of their spines. Yuri Doroshenko stumbled backward, his face ashen. What is that?" Igor's voice shook as he answered, I don't know." He reached for the ice pick beside him, holding it tightly, though he felt a surge of helplessness. The figure remained still, its empty gaze fixed on the group. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it melted back into the shadows, disappearing as if it had never been there. Yet the lingering fear, the sensation of being watched, remained with them. In a hushed, frantic voice, Zenaida whispered, "We need to leave. We can't stay here." But they knew deep down that there was no way out in the darkness. To leave now would be to risk getting lost, to venture into the unknown with nothing but fear to guide them. Reluctantly, they agreed to wait until dawn, hoping the daylight might bring some clarity, or at the very least, some small sense of safety. One by one, they retreated to their tents, though no one expected to sleep. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying faint whispers that seemed to echo the mournful wail they'd heard before. Every rustle, every distant creak of snow set their nerves on edge, and even the familiar act of closing their eyes felt like a dangerous surrender. And as they lay in the tense silence, each hiker felt it, a creeping certainty that the mountain itself was alive, watching them, luring them into something ancient, something they couldn't escape. Story 2. The Mystery of the Climbers on Fuji Mountain. The majestic silhouette of Mount Fuji loomed against the clear blue sky, its snow-capped peak glistening in the morning sun. Revered as a symbol of beauty in Japan, this dormant volcano also harbored a darker side, an unsettling reputation for being the final resting place of numerous climbers. Each year, adventurers from around the globe flocked to its slopes, drawn by the challenge and allure of conquering its heights. Yet for many, the mountain became a one-way ticket into the unknown. Whispers of disappearances echoed through the mountaineering community, tales of experienced climbers who vanished without a trace. Their stories lingered in the air, mixing with the crisp mountain breeze and creating a sense of foreboding. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the terrain, the mountain stood watch, its serene beauty masking the dangers hidden within its folds. This was not just a climb. It was a journey into the heart of mystery. In the shadow of Mount Fuji, 4 climbers prepared for an expedition that would change their lives forever. Yuki Tanaka, a 32-year-old seasoned climber, stood at the forefront. Her long black hair fluttered in the breeze, framing her determined face. With dark eyes reflecting both resilience and vulnerability, Yuki sought to conquer Fuji as a means of healing from a personal loss. Beside her, Hiroshi Sato, a 45-year-old nature photographer with graying hair and a neatly trimmed beard, adjusted his camera gear. Hiroshi had a secret, a connection to a climber who had disappeared years ago, and he hoped to capture the mountain's beauty before facing his past. Akira Nakamura, a spirited 24-year-old with short, tousled hair, exuded confidence. He envisioned this climb as his ticket to becoming a renowned mountain guide. Completing the team was Emiko Suzuki, Yuki's best friend. At 30, her warm smile and reassuring presence provided comfort, though she shared Yuki's concerns about the risks ahead. The air buzzed with excitement as Yuki, Hiroshi, Akira, and Emiko gathered around a table cluttered with maps, gear, and energy bars in the rustic mountain lodge. Each climber discussed their preparations for the expedition. Yuki checked her gear meticulously, ensuring every piece was in top condition. "We need to be ready for anything," she emphasized, her voice steady, though a hint of anxiety lingered beneath the surface. Hiroshi shared tales of previous climbs, his eyes lighting up with enthusiasm as he described the breathtaking vistas. Yet, a shadow crossed his face as he recalled the stories of climbers who had vanished on the mountain. There have been so many unexplained disappearances, he warned, a somber tone punctuating his words. We must be cautious. Emiko, ever the optimist, tried to lighten the mood. We'll make it to the summit together. Think of the views and the photos we can take. Her infectious enthusiasm was met with smiles, though Yuki couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. Akira chimed in. I've trained hard for this. Nothing will stop us. His youthful confidence echoed in the room, momentarily dispelling the tension. As they made final preparations, they couldn't help but feel the weight of the mountain's legacy looming over them. The stories of those lost echoed in their minds, mingling with the excitement of adventure, creating an atmosphere thick with anticipation and apprehension. As dawn broke, the team set out from the lodge, a sense of camaraderie uniting them as they hiked towards the base of Mount Fuji. The path was well trodden, flanked by lush greenery that danced with the morning light. Laughter and chatter filled the air, each step drawing them closer to the majestic peak that towered above. With every passing hour, the terrain shifted. The vibrant greenery gave way to rocky trails and scattered patches of snow. Yuki took the lead, her focus unwavering, while Hiroshi captured the beauty around them through his lens, pausing occasionally to frame the perfect shot. Akira's youthful energy propelled him forward, while Emiko lingered back to ensure everyone stayed together. As they ascended, however, the atmosphere began to change. The playful banter faded into a tense silence as the daunting reality of their surroundings sank in. Dark clouds gathered ominously overhead, casting shadows that seemed to deepen with each step. Just as they reached a narrow ledge, Yuki spotted an old, tattered backpack half buried in the snow. Curiosity piqued, she approached it cautiously. This looks like it belongs to someone who went missing years ago, she whispered, pulling it from the snow. Inside, they found weathered maps and a few personal items, a reminder of those who had attempted the same journey before them. The discovery sent a chill down their spines as the weight of their expedition began to settle in. Night fell swiftly as the group set up camp on a rocky outcrop, the winds picking up and howling through the trees. The fire flickered, casting dancing shadows on their faces as they huddled close for warmth. Despite the day's exhilarating adventure, an uneasy tension had settled among them. The remnants of the abandoned backpack lay nearby, a chilling reminder of the risks they faced. As they sat around the fire, the sounds of the mountain came alive. The wind whistled through the rocks, and distant echoes of unknown origin reverberated in the darkness. Akira, trying to dispel the growing anxiety, suggested they tell ghost stories, a tradition among climbers. It'll be fun, he said, though his enthusiasm faltered as the others exchanged wary glances. Hiroshi cleared his throat, his expression serious. There are real stories that haunt these mountains, tales of climbers who disappeared without a trace. Some say they can still be heard, wandering the peaks. His voice dropped to a whisper, heightening the tension around the fire. Just then, a sudden gust of wind snuffed out their flame, plunging them into darkness. Panic surged through the group as they scrambled for their headlamps. Yuki felt her heart race, a primal instinct warning her that they were not alone. Shadows danced ominously at the edges of their light, and from somewhere in the darkness, a faint whisper seemed to call out to them. "Did you hear that?" Emiko asked, her voice trembling. With their fire extinguished and the darkness pressing in, the group exchanged nervous glances, their previous bravado quickly fading. Yuki's pulse quickened as she scanned the surrounding shadows, feeling an unshakable sense of being watched. "We should check our perimeter," she suggested, her voice steady despite the unease gnawing at her. Hiroshi nodded in agreement, and they began to shine their headlamps into the darkness, illuminating the trees and rocky outcrops. As they ventured a short distance from their campsite, they stumbled upon a series of weathered stone markers, each inscribed with names and dates, a silent graveyard for lost climbers. The realization struck them like a cold wave. This must be a memorial for those who never made it back, Hiroshi murmured, tracing his fingers over the inscriptions. A sense of dread filled the air, as if the mountain itself were reminding them of the dangers they faced. As they stood in somber silence, Akira spoke up, his voice trembling. "What if we're next?" Yuki turned to him, her heart heavy. "We can't let fear control us. We have to stick together and stay focused." Just then, Hiroshi took a step back, visibly shaken. "I have to tell you something. My friend, he disappeared here years ago and I never found out what happened to him." The weight of his confession hung heavily in the air, deepening the atmosphere of tension and suspicion among the group. The revelation hung in the air like a thick fog, casting a pall over the group. Yuki felt her heart drop as she processed Hiroshi's words. "You never told us," she said softly, trying to mask the unease creeping into her voice. Emiko stepped closer to Hiroshi, concern etched on her face. "Why would you keep something like that a secret?" Hiroshi looked down, shame washing over him. "I thought I could face it on this climb. I wanted to find closure, to understand what happened to him." Just then, a roar of wind howled down the mountain, rattling the trees and sending a shiver down their spines. The temperature dropped sharply, and ominous clouds rolled in, blotting out the stars. "We need to head back to camp," Yuki urged, the urgency in her voice cutting through the tension. As they turned to retrace their steps, the storm unleashed its fury. Rain pelted them, quickly soaking their clothes, and the wind whipped around them like a wild beast. Visibility plummeted, and Yuki felt panic rising within her. Suddenly, Akira shouted, "Where's Emiko?" The group spun around, their flashlights frantically searching the chaos. Emiko had been right behind them, but now she was gone. Fear gripped Yuki's chest as they called her name, their voices swallowed by the tempest. The storm seemed to howl with the ghosts of the mountain, the shadows closing in as they desperately sought their friend in the dark. After what felt like an eternity, Yuki and Hiroshi spotted a glimmer of light in the distance. With renewed hope, they stumbled toward it, their hearts racing. As they drew closer, they found Emiko huddled beneath a rocky overhang, trembling but safe. Relief flooded over them, but the moment was bittersweet. The storm had taken a toll on their spirits. As they made their way back to camp, the team moved quietly, the weight of their experience heavy in the air. Each of them carried a sense of loss, not just for the climbers who had vanished before them, but for the innocence of their adventure. They set up camp again, exhausted but relieved to be together. Once settled, they reflected on their journey and the risks they had faced. Yuki's resolve to return to Mount Fuji someday began to take shape, knowing that this mountain would always hold its mysteries, drawing in those brave enough to confront them. Years later, Yuki stood at the base of Mount Fuji, the sun rising behind the peak in a breathtaking display of colors. The memories of that fateful climb lingered in her heart, bittersweet yet powerful. She had returned, not to conquer the mountain, but to honor her friends and the climbers who had come before her. As she gazed up at the towering summit, she felt a deep connection to the mountain and its mysteries. Fuji was a place of beauty and danger, a living entity that would always call to adventurers. Yuki smiled softly, ready to embrace whatever stories awaited her this time.